The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant William Thompson adjusted his red uniform for the 100th time that week. The heavy bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head, and his polished black boots reflected the early light like mirrors. At 28 years old, William had been serving as one of the Queen's Guards for 6 years, and he took immense pride in his role protecting the royal family and maintaining the centuries-old traditions that came with it. Standing perfectly still was more than just a job requirement for William and his fellow guards. It was an art form that required incredible discipline, mental strength, and physical endurance. Tourists from around the world would gather daily, hoping to catch even the slightest movement or reaction from these stoic figures. Children would wave enthusiastically, adults would pose for photos, and occasionally someone would try their best to make the guards laugh or flinch. Through it all, William and his colleagues remained as motionless as statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their faces expressionless. The rules were crystal clear and had been drilled into every guard from their first day of training. Under no circumstances were they to break character while on duty. They were not to speak, smile, wave, or acknowledge the public in any way. Their role was to be living symbols of British tradition and royal protection, standing as silent sentinels who represented the dignity and honor of the crown. Breaking these rules could result in severe disciplinary action, including potential dismissal from the prestigious position. William understood the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat. Every day, thousands of visitors came to see the changing of the guard ceremony and to witness these legendary figures in person. For many tourists, seeing the Queen's Guards was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and William knew that maintaining the mystique and tradition was crucial to preserving the magic that drew people from every corner of the globe. The palace grounds buzzed with activity as the morning progressed. Tour groups gathered in clusters, their guides explaining the history and significance of the guard ceremony. Street performers entertained crowds just outside the palace gates, and souvenir vendors sold miniature versions of the guards' famous hats and toy soldiers, dressed in red uniforms. The atmosphere was always festive, filled with excitement and wonder as people from different cultures and backgrounds came together to witness a piece of living history. As William took his position at the main entrance, he noticed a small commotion near the palace fence. A school group had arrived, and about 30 children, all wearing matching bright yellow jackets, were being organized by their teachers for a group photo. The children ranged in age from about 6 to 10 years old, their faces bright with curiosity and excitement. Several of them pointed at William and whispered to their friends, clearly amazed by his impressive uniform and statuesque presence. One little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile pressed her face against the fence, trying to get a better look at the guard. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she studied every detail of his uniform, from the golden buttons on his red tunic to the impressive plume on his bearskin hat. She whispered something to her friend, and both girls giggled softly, their innocent joy adding a lightness to the formal atmosphere surrounding the palace. William had seen countless school groups during his years of service. Children were always the most enthusiastic visitors, their natural curiosity and lack of inhibition making them particularly entertaining to observe, even if he couldn't show any reaction. They would wave with both hands, jump up and down, and sometimes even try to mimic the guard's serious expressions, causing their classmates to burst into laughter. The teacher began gathering the children for their planned photo session, explaining in a patient voice that they needed to stay together and be respectful of the guards in the palace. She reminded them that the guards were working and couldn't talk or move, but that didn't make them any less special or important. The children nodded solemnly, though their excitement was barely contained as they continued to steal glances at William and the other guards positioned around the courtyard. As the group prepared for their photo, William noticed something that made his heart skip a beat, though his expression remained perfectly neutral. Among the children, he spotted a small boy who appeared different from the others. The child was in a wheelchair being pushed gently by one of the accompanying adults. Despite his physical challenges, the boy's face shone with the same excitement and wonder as his classmates. His eyes darted between the various guards, trying to take in every detail of the scene before him. The boy raised his hand slightly, offering a small wave toward William. His movement was careful and deliberate, as if he understood the solemnity of the moment but couldn't contain his desire to somehow connect with the impressive figure standing before him. The gesture was so pure and heartfelt that William felt something stir deep within him, a feeling that challenged every rule and regulation he had sworn to uphold. This moment would prove to be the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would test William's commitment to protocol against his natural human compassion. The sight of the child's hopeful face and gentle wave created a conflict within him that he had never experienced during his years of service. Every fiber of his training told him to remain motionless and ignore the gesture, but something deeper, something fundamentally human, urged him to acknowledge the boy's innocent attempt at connection. The palace courtyard seemed to hold its breath as this silent drama unfolded, with William standing frozen not just by duty, but by the weight of a decision that would soon challenge everything he had been taught about being a Queen's Guard. The little boy in the wheelchair continued to look up at William with bright, hopeful eyes. His name was Jamie, and he was 8 years old. This trip to London was the highlight of his young life, something his parents had saved for months to make possible. Jamie had been born with a rare muscular condition that required him to use a wheelchair, but his spirit remained unbroken, and his curiosity about the world around him was boundless. Mrs. Henderson, Jamie's teacher, had noticed his fascination with the guards from the moment they arrived. Throughout the bus ride to the palace, Jamie had peppered her with questions about the Queen's Guards. He wanted to know how long they had to stand still, whether their hats were heavy, if they ever got tired, and why they wore such bright red uniforms. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon other children in the class were asking questions too. What made Jamie's situation particularly touching was the effort his classmates made to include him in everything. When they gathered for the group photo, his friends naturally positioned themselves around his wheelchair, making sure he had the best view possible of the guards. They described details he might miss from his lower vantage point, whispering about the intricate golden braiding on the uniforms and the way the morning sun made the guards' buttons gleam. As William stood motionless, he could hear fragments of the children's excited chatter. Jamie's voice stood out among the others, not because it was louder, but because of the genuine awe and respect in his tone when he spoke about the guards. The boy wasn't trying to be disruptive or silly like some visitors. Instead, he seemed to understand that he was witnessing something special and important. The teacher raised her camera to capture the moment, instructing the children to smile and look toward her. But Jamie's attention remained fixed on William. The boy had noticed something that the others had missed. Despite William's perfectly still exterior, there was something in the guard's eyes, a warmth and awareness that suggested he was not just a statue, but a real person with feelings and thoughts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jamie raised his hand again. This time his wave was even more gentle, accompanied by the sweetest smile William had ever seen. The boy's gesture wasn't demanding attention or trying to break the guard's concentration. It was simply a child's way of showing respect and acknowledgement to someone he admired. At that moment, something extraordinary happened within William's mind. All his years of rigid training seemed to fade into the background as he was confronted with pure, innocent humanity. The boy's condition, his obvious joy despite his challenges, and his respectful demeanor created a perfect storm of emotion that William found impossible to ignore. The other tourists and visitors in the courtyard went about their business, taking photos and chatting among themselves, completely unaware of the internal struggle taking place within the motionless guard. William's training screamed at him to maintain protocol, to keep his eyes forward and his expression neutral. But his heart, his human compassion, urged him to acknowledge this special child who had shown such genuine respect and admiration. William thought about his own nephew, who was about Jamie's age. He remembered the excitement in the boy's eyes when William had visited in his uniform, the countless questions about his duties, and the pride his family felt in his service. This memory made Jamie's situation even more poignant. Here was a child who might never have the opportunity to meet a real guard up close, who had traveled far to see this ceremony, and who was showing such genuine appreciation for the tradition William represented. The internal battle intensified as William considered the consequences of breaking character. He could face disciplinary action, possible dismissal, and the disappointment of his commanding officers. The Queen's Guards were held to the highest standards, and any deviation from protocol was taken seriously. But as he watched Jamie's hopeful expression, William realized that sometimes the most important rules weren't written in military manuals. The moment stretched on, feeling like an eternity to William but probably lasting only seconds in real time. The teacher was still positioning the children for the photo, giving William precious moments to make his decision. He could see that Jamie was beginning to lower his hand, perhaps thinking that his gesture would go unacknowledged like so many others before him. Other guards in the courtyard remained perfectly still, their training and discipline keeping them focused on their duties. William envied their apparent ease in maintaining protocol, but he also realized that they might not have noticed Jamie or understood the significance of this particular moment. Each guard dealt with hundreds of interactions every day, and it would be easy to miss the special quality of this child's respectful approach. William's breathing remained steady and controlled, but his mind raced as he considered his options. He could continue to follow protocol and maintain his stillness, knowing that Jamie would eventually give up and turn his attention elsewhere. Or he could take a risk, break with tradition for just a moment, and acknowledge this remarkable child who had shown such genuine respect and admiration. The sound of the teacher's voice calling for everyone to look at the camera provided a natural distraction. Most of the children turned toward her, but Jamie's eyes remained on William as if sensing that something important was about to happen. The boy's expression held no demand or expectation, only hope and patient waiting. This was the moment of truth for William, the moment when he would have to choose between strict adherence to military protocol and responding to a child's innocent gesture of respect and friendship. Without breaking his rigid posture, William made a decision that would change everything. Moving only his eyes, he shifted his gaze downward to meet Jamie's hopeful face. For just a moment, their eyes connected, and William allowed the slightest hint of warmth to show in his expression. It was barely perceptible to anyone else, but for Jamie, it was like receiving a personal message from a real-life hero. The little boy's face lit up with pure joy. His smile grew even wider, and he pressed both hands to his heart as if to contain his excitement. Jamie understood that he had just experienced something magical, something that made him feel special and acknowledged. He didn't shout or draw attention to the moment. Instead, he simply mouthed the words "thank you" and gave one final gentle wave. William's heart swelled with an emotion he had never felt while on duty. The connection with Jamie lasted only seconds, but it felt profound and meaningful. He had broken protocol, yes, but he had also honored something much more important: the innocent respect of a child who saw past the uniform. To the human being underneath, Mrs. Henderson noticed the change in Jamie's demeanor immediately. The boy was practically glowing with happiness, and she wondered what had caused such a dramatic shift in his mood. She looked toward the guard Jamie had been watching, but William had already returned his gaze to its proper position, looking straight ahead as if nothing had happened. The photo session continued with the children posing and smiling for their group picture. Jamie participated enthusiastically, his earlier interaction with William having filled him with a confidence and joy that was infectious. His classmates noticed his improved spirits, and several asked what had made him so happy. Jamie simply smiled mysteriously and said that the guard was really nice. As the school group prepared to move on to their next destination, Jamie kept looking back at William. The boy seemed to understand that their moment had been special and unique, something not to be taken for granted or expected to happen again. He waved one more time as his wheelchair was pushed toward the palace gates, and though William couldn't acknowledge it visibly, he felt a deep satisfaction knowing that he had made a difference in the child's day. What William didn't know was that his small act of kindness had been witnessed by someone very important. Captain Davies, the officer in charge of the guard detail that day, had been observing from a discreet location near the palace entrance. He had seen the entire interaction between William and Jamie, and he had watched the transformation it created in both the guard and the child. Captain Davies was a veteran of 30 years in the military, and he had served as a Queen's Guard himself in his younger days. He understood better than anyone the importance of maintaining protocol and the discipline required to stand motionless for hours at a time. But he also understood that sometimes the spirit of service went beyond rigid adherence to rules. As the school group disappeared from view, Captain Davies approached William's position. The sergeant continued to stand at attention, unsure whether his small breach of protocol had been noticed by his superiors. His mind raced with potential consequences, but he felt no regret for his actions. The memory of Jamie's joyful face was worth whatever disciplinary action might follow. When Captain Davies reached William's position, he didn't immediately speak. Instead, he stood quietly beside the guard for several minutes, observing the continuing flow of tourists and visitors. Finally, in a voice low enough that only William could hear, he spoke. "Sergeant Thompson, I witnessed your interaction with the young boy in the wheelchair," Captain Davies said quietly. William's heart sank, expecting a reprimand or worse. "I want you to know that what you did today exemplifies the very best of what it means to serve the Crown and the people of this nation." William was stunned. He had expected punishment, not praise. Captain Davies continued, "The Queen's Guards represent more than just military precision and protocol. We represent the humanity and compassion of the British people. What you did for that child today honored both our traditions and our values." The captain explained that he had been watching the school group since their arrival, and he had noticed Jamie's respectful behavior and obvious admiration for the guards. He had also observed how the boy's classmates included him and supported him throughout the visit. When he saw William's subtle acknowledgement of Jamie's greeting, he realized he was witnessing something special. "There will be no disciplinary action," Captain Davies assured William. "In fact, I believe what you did today should serve as an example to other guards about when it's appropriate to show our human side while still maintaining the dignity of our position." William felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by a deep sense of pride. He had taken a risk in breaking protocol, but it had been the right thing to do. Captain Davies' words confirmed that sometimes the most important rules were the unwritten ones about treating people with kindness and respect. The captain shared that he had received similar training about maintaining strict protocol, but over his years of service he had learned that the most memorable and meaningful moments often came when guards showed their humanity while still honoring their duties. He mentioned other instances where guards had made small gestures to acknowledge special visitors, particularly children or veterans, and how these moments had strengthened rather than weakened the public's respect for the Queen's Guards. As their conversation concluded, Captain Davies placed a hand briefly on William's shoulder, a gesture of support and approval that meant more than any formal commendation could. William understood that he had not only avoided punishment, but had actually earned the respect of his commanding officer for making a difficult decision, guided by compassion rather than fear. Word of William's compassionate gesture began to spread quietly among the other guards in the days that followed. The story was shared not as gossip, but as an example of how to balance military discipline with human kindness. Each guard who heard the tale found themselves reflecting on their own experiences with visitors, particularly children, and considering how they might respond if faced with a similar situation. Guardsman Peters, who had been serving alongside William for 3 years, was particularly moved by the story. He had always been one of the most rigid adherents to protocol, never allowing even the slightest deviation from proper procedure. But hearing about Jamie and William's interaction made him reconsider the true purpose of their role. Were they meant to be completely inhuman statues, or were they representatives of the best qualities of their nation? The following week brought another school group to the palace, and Peters found himself paying closer attention to the children's faces and behaviors. He noticed how some children were obviously nervous or intimidated by the imposing figures in their towering hats and serious expressions. Others were excited and curious, pointing out details of the uniforms to their friends and teachers. Among this new group of visitors was a little girl named Sophie, who appeared to be about 7 years old. She had arrived with her grandmother, who was visiting from Scotland and had promised to show her granddaughter the famous guards. Sophie had been talking about this moment for weeks, having seen pictures of the Queen's Guards in storybooks and wanting desperately to see them in real life. What made Sophie's visit particularly special was that she had prepared for it in a unique way. The little girl had spent hours drawing a picture of a Queen's Guard, complete with the red uniform, tall black hat, and serious expression. She had carefully colored it with her best crayons and had brought it with her to London, hoping somehow to show it to one of the real guards. As Sophie and her grandmother approached the palace, the little girl clutched her drawing tightly, her eyes wide with wonder at seeing the guards in person. Her grandmother explained quietly that the guards couldn't talk or move because they were working, but that didn't diminish Sophie's excitement. She studied Peters intently, comparing his uniform to her drawing and whispering observations to her grandmother. Peters noticed the child's obvious preparation and enthusiasm. He could see that she was holding something in her small hands, though he couldn't make out exactly what it was. The girl's grandmother lifted her up slightly so she could get a better view, and Sophie's face beamed with pure joy at being closer to the impressive figure she had only imagined before. After several minutes of observation, Sophie made a decision. She carefully unfolded her drawing and held it up toward Peters, showing him her artistic interpretation of a queen's guard. The picture was charmingly imperfect, with the proportions slightly off and the colors not quite matching reality, but it was clearly created with love and admiration. Peters felt the same internal conflict that William had experienced days earlier. Here was a child who had put time and effort into creating something beautiful, who had brought it specifically to share with a guard, and who was looking at him with such hopeful expectation. The drawing represented hours of work and weeks of anticipation, all culminating in this moment. The grandmother seemed to understand that her granddaughter was hoping for some kind of acknowledgement. She gently explained to Sophie that the guard might not be able to respond, but that didn't mean he couldn't see or appreciate her artwork. Sophie nodded solemnly but continued to hold up her drawing, convinced that somehow the guard would want to see what she had created. Peters remembered William's story and Captain Davies' words about representing the humanity and compassion of the British people. He thought about the little girl's obvious effort and preparation, and he realized that this was exactly the kind of moment when breaking protocol slightly might serve a higher purpose. Very carefully, keeping his body perfectly still, Peters allowed his eyes to move downward to focus on Sophie's drawing. He studied it intently for several seconds, taking in all the details she had included. The little girl noticed his attention immediately, and her face lit up with excitement at realizing that the guard was actually looking at her artwork. Peters then did something that surprised even himself. While maintaining his rigid posture, he allowed the corners of his mouth to turn up in the slightest hint of a smile. It was barely visible, but Sophie caught it immediately. She pressed the drawing to her chest and beamed with pride, knowing that she had successfully shared her creation with a real Queen's Guard. The grandmother noticed the subtle interaction and felt tears welling up in her eyes. She understood that her granddaughter had just experienced something magical, something that would become a treasured memory for years to come. She gently guided Sophie away from the guard's position, but not before the little girl gave a respectful curtsy, something she had practiced at home in preparation for meeting the Queen's Guards. As they walked away, Sophie chattered excitedly about how the guard had looked at her picture and even smiled at her. Her grandmother listened with growing amazement, realizing that her granddaughter had witnessed something truly special. The drawing would be carefully preserved as a memento of this incredible day when a Queen's Guard broke his serious demeanor just enough to acknowledge a child's heartfelt gesture. Peters felt a warmth spreading through his chest as he watched Sophie and her grandmother disappear into the crowd. He had followed William's example and had discovered that showing compassion didn't diminish his role as a guard. It enhanced it. The memory of Sophie's joyful reaction would stay with him throughout his remaining hours of duty that day. The story of the guard's compassionate gestures continued to ripple through the palace community, eventually reaching the ears of some unexpected listeners. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a member of the palace administrative staff who had worked there for over 20 years, heard about both William's interaction with Jamie and Peter's acknowledgement of Sophie's drawing. As someone who coordinated many of the palace's community outreach programs, she was deeply moved by these accounts. Mrs. Patterson had been looking for ways to make the palace more accessible and welcoming to children with special needs and their families. She had observed over the years how intimidated some young visitors could be by the formal atmosphere and rigid protocols of the palace tours. The stories of the guards' kindness gave her an idea that could potentially transform how certain groups experienced their visits. She arranged a meeting with Captain Davies to discuss the possibility of creating special guidelines for guards when interacting with children, particularly those with disabilities or special circumstances. Her proposal was carefully crafted to maintain the dignity and tradition of the Queen's Guards while allowing for moments of appropriate human connection. Captain Davies was intrigued by Mrs. Patterson's suggestions. He had been thinking about the incidents with William and Peters, and he had come to believe that these moments of compassion actually strengthened rather than weakened the public's perception of the guards. The idea of having official guidelines that permitted such interactions under specific circumstances seemed both practical and heartwarming. Together, they developed what they privately called the Children's Protocol, a set of discreet guidelines that would allow guards to acknowledge young visitors in subtle but meaningful ways when circumstances warranted it. The protocol emphasized that any such interactions must be minimal, respectful, and appropriate, never compromising the guards' primary duties or the solemnity of their position. The new approach was quietly implemented over the following months, with guards receiving training on when and how such acknowledgments might be appropriate. The guidelines specified that interactions should be reserved for children who demonstrated exceptional respect, those with obvious disabilities or special needs, or situations where a small gesture could have a significant positive impact. Word of this unofficial policy began to spread among families and school groups, though not in any formal way. Parents and teachers who had witnessed the guards' occasional small gestures of acknowledgement shared their experiences with others, creating a quiet awareness that the Queen's Guards, while maintaining their traditional dignity, also possessed hearts capable of recognizing and responding to children's innocent admiration. 3 months after the original incident with Jamie, an extraordinary visitor arrived at the palace. A young boy named Marcus, who was 9 years old and battling leukemia, had been granted a wish through a children's charity organization. His greatest dream was to meet a real Queen's Guard and to learn about their duties and traditions. Marcus arrived with his parents, 2 nurses, and a representative from the charity organization. He was thin and pale from his treatments, and he wore a knit cap to cover his head where he had lost his hair due to chemotherapy. Despite his physical challenges, Marcus's eyes sparkled with excitement and determination. This visit represented a bright spot in what had been a very difficult year for him and his family. The charity representative had coordinated with Mrs. Patterson to arrange a special visit that would allow Marcus to observe the guards up close and perhaps learn more about their role. What Marcus didn't know was that Sergeant William Thompson had specifically requested to be on duty during the boy's visit, having been deeply moved by the story of this brave young visitor. When Marcus's group arrived at the palace, William was positioned at his usual post near the main entrance. The boy immediately spotted the impressive figure in the red uniform and pointed excitedly toward him. His parents had to steady him as his excitement threatened to overwhelm his weakened physical condition. But nothing could diminish the joy on his face at seeing a real Queen's Guard in person. Mrs. Patterson accompanied Marcus and his family as they approached William's position. She had prepared the boy for the visit by explaining that the guards had very important jobs and couldn't talk or move very much, but that they were real people who cared about visitors, especially brave children like Marcus. As they drew closer, Marcus studied every detail of William's uniform with intense fascination. He asked his parents quiet questions about the various elements of the guard's appearance, from the intricate braiding on the red tunic to the impressive plume on the bearskin hat. His knowledge about the guards was remarkable for someone his age, clearly the result of extensive research and preparation for this special day. When they reached the optimal viewing position, Marcus did something that touched everyone present. Despite his weakness, he straightened his small shoulders and attempted to stand as tall and straight as possible, mimicking what he perceived to be the proper posture of a guard. His gesture was his way of showing respect and understanding for the discipline and bearing that the position required. William noticed the boy's attempt to mirror his posture, and he was struck by the child's obvious respect and admiration. Here was a young person facing incredible challenges with remarkable courage, taking the time to show proper appreciation for the traditions and duties that William represented. The moment called for something special, something that would honor both the boy's bravery and the dignity of the guard's position. William made a decision that would create one of the most memorable moments in recent palace history. While maintaining his formal stance, he began to execute a slow, deliberate movement that was both within protocol and deeply meaningful. He performed what is known as the present arms salute, raising his rifle in a crisp, ceremonial motion that is typically reserved for high-ranking officials and members of the royal family. The gesture was extraordinary, not because of the movement itself, but because of what it represented. William was offering Marcus the same level of respect and recognition that would normally be given only to the most distinguished visitors to the palace. The salute acknowledged the boy's courage, his respectful behavior, and his obvious admiration for the traditions of the Queen's Guards. Marcus's eyes widened with amazement as he watched the ceremonial salute unfold before him. He might not have understood all the technical aspects of military protocol, but he certainly grasped the significance of the moment. The guard was honoring him, recognizing him as someone worthy of respect and acknowledgement. For a child who had spent months feeling weak and different due to his illness, this gesture was profoundly empowering. The boy's parents were moved to tears as they witnessed their son receiving this incredible honor. They had watched Marcus struggle through countless medical procedures and treatments, always trying to maintain his spirits despite the challenges he faced. To see him standing a little taller and beaming with pride as the guard saluted him was a gift they would treasure forever. Mrs. Patterson, who had hoped for a positive interaction but had never imagined something this remarkable, felt her heart swell with emotion. She realized that this moment would become part of palace folklore, a story that would be shared and remembered long after Marcus's visit had ended. The charity representative was already taking photos to document this extraordinary gesture of respect and kindness. After completing the salute, William returned to his standard position, but the impact of his action continued to resonate. Marcus stood a little straighter, his chest puffed out with pride as he tried to match the guard's dignified bearing. The boy's transformation was visible to everyone present, from a sick child seeking inspiration to a young person who felt acknowledged and honored by someone he deeply admired. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the palace staff. Other guards who were positioned around the courtyard had witnessed the salute, and they understood immediately that they had just observed something truly special. The gesture had been performed with perfect military precision, while simultaneously conveying deep human compassion. Captain Davies, who had been monitoring the visit from a discreet location, approached the group after William had completed his salute. Instead of speaking to William directly, he addressed Marcus, introducing himself as the officer in charge and explaining that the salute the boy had just received was a mark of great respect that was not given lightly. "Young man," Captain Davies said to Marcus, "what you just experienced is something that very few visitors to this palace ever witness. Sergeant Thompson has honored you with a gesture that recognizes your courage and your respectful appreciation for our traditions. You should be very proud." Marcus listened intently to Captain Davies's words, and when the officer finished speaking, the boy did something remarkable. He attempted his own version of a military salute, raising his thin hand to his forehead in what was clearly his best interpretation of proper form. His salute was imperfect but heartfelt, his way of returning the honor he had received. The captain, deeply moved by Marcus's response, stood at attention and returned the boy's salute with full military precision. This exchange between the young cancer patient and the senior officer created a moment of mutual respect and understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between civilians and military personnel. As Marcus's visit continued, other guards around the palace seemed to sense that something special was happening. While maintaining their positions and duties, several of them found subtle ways to acknowledge the brave young visitor as he passed by their posts. One guard allowed his eyes to track Marcus's movement, another offered the slightest nod of recognition, and a third maintained eye contact with the boy for several meaningful seconds. These small gestures, while carefully executed within the bounds of protocol, created a trail of acknowledgement that followed Marcus throughout his palace visit. The boy began to understand that he was receiving something extraordinary, that these impressive figures were going beyond their normal duties to recognize him as someone special and worthy of their respect. The visit concluded, with Marcus and his family being given a brief audience with one of the palace's senior staff members, who presented the boy with a commemorative certificate recognizing his visit and acknowledging his courage in facing his medical challenges. The certificate was signed not only by the staff member, but also by Captain Davies, making it an official recognition of Marcus's special day at the palace. As the group prepared to leave, Marcus looked back at William one final time. The boy straightened his shoulders again and offered another salute, this one more confident and precise than his earlier attempt. William, while maintaining his forward gaze, allowed the slightest smile to cross his features, a final acknowledgement of the remarkable young visitor who had touched the hearts of everyone he encountered. The story of Marcus's visit would be retold countless times in the weeks and months that followed, becoming an integral part of the growing legend of the Queen's Guards, who were not afraid to show their humanity when faced with truly exceptional circumstances. The visit had demonstrated that military precision and human compassion could coexist beautifully, enhancing rather than diminishing the dignity of the Guard's important role. 6 months after Marcus's inspiring visit, the impact of these compassionate gestures had created a subtle but profound change in the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace. Families planning visits to see the Queen's Guards often shared stories they had heard about the Guards' occasional acknowledgments of special young visitors. While no one expected such interactions, parents began teaching their children about showing proper respect and appreciation, hoping their little ones might be among the fortunate few to experience a moment of connection. The Guards themselves had developed a quiet sense of pride in their growing reputation for balancing military discipline with human kindness. They understood that their primary duty remained unchanged, to serve as dignified protectors and representatives of royal tradition. But they also recognized that their role had evolved to include serving as ambassadors of British values, including compassion and respect for all people, especially those facing challenges or showing genuine appreciation for their service. William Thompson, now promoted to staff sergeant, had become something of a mentor to newer Guards joining the ranks. During training sessions, he would share the story of Jamie, the boy in the wheelchair, and explain how that moment had taught him that true military bearing included the wisdom to know when human connection was more important than rigid adherence to rules. His experiences had shown him that the most powerful way to honor the crown was sometimes to show the heart that beat beneath the uniform. The palace had begun receiving letters from families whose children had experienced these special moments with the Guards. Parents wrote to express their gratitude for the kindness shown to their sons and daughters, describing how these brief interactions had become treasured family memories. Some letters came from children themselves, written in crayon or colored pencil, thanking the Guards for their service and sharing drawings of their own. One particularly moving letter arrived from Jamie's mother, written nearly a year after his original visit. She described how that moment of acknowledgement from William had given her son a confidence boost that lasted for months. Jamie had become fascinated with British history and military traditions, and he had begun participating in a youth program for children with disabilities that focused on community service and civic responsibility. The letter included a photo of Jamie in a miniature red uniform, standing as straight as his condition allowed, clearly inspired by his encounter with the Queen's Guard. Marcus's story had taken an even more remarkable turn. His cancer treatments had been successful and he was now in remission. His parents wrote to inform the palace staff that Marcus often spoke about his visit and the respect he had been shown by the Guards. The experience had given him strength during his most difficult treatments, and he had begun volunteering at the Children's Hospital, sharing his story with other young patients to help them find hope and courage. Mrs. Patterson had compiled these letters and stories into a special album that was shared with the Guard units. Reading about the lasting impact of their small gestures of kindness had reinforced for the Guards that their role extended far beyond ceremony and tradition. They were creating memories that would last lifetimes, inspiring children to be brave, respectful, and proud of their heritage. The success of the informal children's protocol had attracted attention from other royal residences and ceremonial units around the country. Representatives from Windsor Castle and the Tower of London had inquired about implementing similar guidelines, recognizing that the balance between tradition and compassion could enhance rather than diminish the public's respect for these important institutions. Captain Davies, now approaching retirement, reflected on how the simple decision to support William's moment of compassion had led to such positive changes. He had learned that true leadership sometimes meant having the courage to support subordinates who made difficult decisions based on their conscience rather than their rulebook. The respect and admiration that the Guards now enjoyed from the public was greater than ever before, precisely because people understood that behind the magnificent uniforms were real human beings with genuine care for others. As another group of schoolchildren gathered in the palace courtyard on a bright spring morning, the current Guards on duty watched with alert eyes, not just for security purposes, but to identify those special moments when a child's respect and admiration called for acknowledgement. They had learned that being a Queen's Guard meant more than standing still and looking impressive. It meant representing the very best of what their nation could be: strong, dignified, traditional, but also kind, compassionate, and responsive to the innocent wonder of children who looked up to them as heroes. The stories of Jamie, Sophie, Marcus, and dozens of other children had become part of the oral tradition, passed down from one generation of guards to the next. These tales served as reminders that sometimes the most important duties were the ones that weren't written in any manual. The duty to recognize courage, to acknowledge respect, and to show that beneath the formal exterior of a Queen's Guard beat the heart of someone who understood that serving the crown meant serving all the people, especially the smallest and most vulnerable among them. The Queen's Guards had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in their ability to remain motionless, but in their wisdom to know when movement, even the slightest gesture, could make all the difference in a child's world. They had learned to break character not by abandoning their duty, but by fulfilling it in the most human and heartfelt way possible.